In the cold gray dawn of the 30th of January, 1649, a king stepped onto a scaffold in the heart of London, his breath visible in the frigid air, his fate sealed by the very people he once ruled. Charles I, the anointed monarch of England, Scotland, and Ireland, faced a crowd of his subjects not as their sovereign, but as a condemned traitor, stripped of divine right and humbled by the axe that awaited him. The cobblestones of Whitehall, usually echoing with the clatter of royal processions, now bore witness to an unprecedented act of regicide that would shatter the ancient order of monarchy and plunge a nation into uncharted waters. This was no mere execution. It was a declaration of war against the very idea of kingship, a moment so audacious that it reverberated through centuries. How did a king, believed to be God's chosen, come to such a brutal and unthinkable end? To understand the trial and execution of Charles I, we must first step back into the turbulent world of 17th century England, a land torn by religious fervor, political upheaval, and the clash of absolute power against the rising tide of parliamentary authority. Charles I ascended to the throne in 1625, inheriting a kingdom from his father, James I, who had already sown seeds of discontent with his belief in the divine right of kingship doctrine that placed the monarch above all earthly laws, answerable only to God. Charles, a man of refined tastes, deep religious conviction, and an unyielding sense of his own authority, embraced this ideology with fervor. He was a slight figure, often reserved and stammering in speech, yet beneath his quiet demeanor lay a stubborn resolve that would prove his undoing. His marriage to Henrietta Maria, a Catholic princess from France, further alienated many of his Protestant subjects, who feared a return to papal influence in a nation still scarred by the Reformation. England in the early 17th century was a cauldron of tension, simmering with grievances over taxation, religion, and governance. The Protestant Reformation had fractured the spiritual landscape, leaving Puritan zealous reformers seeking to purify the Church of England of Catholic remnants clashing with the more traditional Anglican establishment that Charles favored. Economically, the kingdom struggled under the weight of wars and royal extravagance, while politically, the balance of power between king and parliament teetered on a knife's edge. Parliament, composed of elected representatives from the gentry and merchant classes, sought greater control over taxation and policy, viewing themselves as the voice of the people. Charles, however, saw their demands as an affront to his God-given authority, believing that to yield to them would be to betray his sacred duty. The early years of Charles's reign were marked by a series of missteps that deepened the rift between Crown and Commons. In 1629, frustrated by Parliament's refusal to grant him funds without concessions, Charles dissolved the body and embarked on what became known as the personal rule, an 11-year period during which he governed without parliamentary consent. He imposed taxes like the infamous ship money levy, originally meant for coastal defense but extended inland without approval, fueling resentment among his subjects who saw it as tyranny. His religious policies, enforced by his ally Archbishop William Laud, further inflamed tensions. Laud's push for uniformity in worship, with an emphasis on ceremony and hierarchy, alienated Puritans who decried it as creeping Catholicism. Across the kingdom, whispers of discontent grew into roars of outrage, as men and women began to question whether their king truly ruled for their benefit or for his own aggrandizement. Beyond England's borders, Charles's policies also sowed discord. In Scotland, his attempt to impose the Anglican Book of Common Prayer in 1637 sparked the Bishops' Wars, as the staunchly Presbyterian Scots rebelled against what they saw as an assault on their faith. Unable to fund a military campaign without parliamentary support, Charles was forced to recall Parliament in 1640, ending his personal rule. But this was no reconciliation. The so-called Short Parliament was dissolved after just 3 weeks when it refused to grant funds without addressing grievances. A second attempt, the Long Parliament, convened later that year under dire circumstances, with Scotland's rebellions still raging and England's coffers empty. This body would prove to be Charles's nemesis, as it moved swiftly to curb his powers, abolish hated taxes, and even arrest his closest advisors, including Archbishop Laud. As the 1640s dawned, the stage was set for a conflict that would tear the nation apart. Charles, unyielding in his belief in absolute monarchy, faced a parliament increasingly emboldened to challenge his authority. The divide was not merely political but deeply personal, rooted in mutual distrust and irreconcilable visions of what England should be. On one side stood a king who saw himself as the father of his people, ordained by God to rule without question. On the other, a growing coalition of parliamentarians, merchants, and religious reformers who believed power should be shared, or even wrested from the crown entirely. This clash of ideals would soon erupt into open warfare, a civil conflict that would test the very foundations of the kingdom and lead Charles to a fate no English monarch had ever faced before. The historical backdrop of Charles I's reign reveals a man caught between the weight of tradition and the winds of change. His belief in divine right, while sincere, blinded him to the shifting loyalties of his people, many of whom no longer saw monarchy as an unassailable institution. His policies, from taxation to religion, alienated key segments of society, while his refusal to compromise with Parliament set the stage for a showdown that would redefine England's future. As we move forward in this story, we will see how these early tensions exploded into the English Civil War, a brutal struggle that pitted brother against brother and ultimately placed a king on trial for his life. But for now, the seeds of discord have been sown, and the path to that fateful scaffold in 1649 has begun. As the 1640s unfolded, the simmering tensions between King Charles I and his Parliament ignited into a firestorm that would consume England in bloodshed and division. The Long Parliament, convened in 1640, was no mere advisory body. It was a gathering of men determined to rein in a monarch they viewed as increasingly tyrannical. Their grievances were many: unlawful taxation, religious overreach, and the king's apparent disdain for their role in governance. But their resolve was singular. Charles must be made to answer to the will of the people, or at least to the will of those who represented them. The king, however, saw their demands as nothing short of rebellion against God's ordained order. This irreconcilable clash of visions propelled the nation toward a conflict that would become known as the English Civil War, a struggle not just for power, but for the very soul of the kingdom. The early sessions of the Long Parliament were marked by bold moves against royal authority. They passed the Triennial Act in 1641, mandating that Parliament must meet at least every 3 years, a direct check on Charles's ability to rule without them. They abolished the hated ship money tax and dismantled the Star Chamber, a royal court notorious for its harsh and arbitrary judgments. Most strikingly, they targeted Charles's closest advisors, impeaching Archbishop William Laud for treason and executing Thomas Wentworth, Earl of Strafford, one of the king's most loyal lieutenants. Strafford's death in May 1641 was a chilling warning to Charles. Even those closest to the crown were not beyond the reach of parliamentary wrath. Yet, rather than cowing the king into submission, these actions only deepened his resolve to reassert his dominance, convinced that yielding would mean the end of monarchy itself. Charles, for his part, was not without fault in escalating the crisis. His mistrust of Parliament was matched by a series of miscalculations that further eroded what little goodwill remained. In November 1641, news of a brutal rebellion in Ireland where Catholic insurgents massacred Protestant settlers shocked England and heightened fears of a Catholic conspiracy, with many pointing fingers at Charles's Catholic queen, Henrietta Maria. Parliament demanded control over the military to suppress the rebellion, fearing the king might use such forces against them instead. Charles refused, seeing this as yet another assault on his prerogative. The situation reached a boiling point in January 1642, when Charles made a fateful decision that would tip the nation into open conflict. Accompanied by armed guards, he marched into the House of Commons to arrest 5 members he accused of treason for their opposition to him. The Speaker of the House famously refused to betray their whereabouts, declaring his loyalty to Parliament over the king. The intrusion was a shocking breach of parliamentary privilege, and as news spread, London erupted in outrage. Charles, sensing the danger, fled the capital with his family, leaving behind a city now firmly in the grip of his enemies. This dramatic confrontation marked the point of no return. By the summer of 1642, both sides began raising armies, with Charles establishing his base in Oxford and Parliament, consolidating power in London. The king rallied loyalists known as cavaliers who supported the monarchy and the established church, often drawn from the nobility and rural gentry. Parliament, backed by the emerging middle classes, merchants, and Puritans, fielded the Roundheads, named for their cropped hairstyles that contrasted with the flowing locks of their royalist foes. What followed was a war unlike any England had seen before, a civil conflict that tore families apart and turned neighbor against neighbor. Battles raged across the countryside, from the rolling hills of Edgehill in 1642, where the first major clash ended in a bloody stalemate, to the decisive parliamentary victory at Marston Moor in 1644, which secured the north for the Roundheads under the command of Oliver Cromwell, a rising military leader whose name would soon become synonymous with the anti-royalist cause. The war was not merely a contest of arms, but a profound ideological struggle. For Charles, it was a defense of divine right, a battle to preserve the sacred hierarchy that placed him at the apex of society. For Parliament, it was a fight for liberty, for a vision of governance where the king's power was bound by law and the consent of the governed. Yet, as the conflict dragged on, the human cost became staggering. Towns were sacked, crops destroyed, and disease spread through armies and civilian populations alike. The king's early successes gave way to mounting losses as Parliament's new model army, a disciplined force forged by Cromwell and Sir Thomas Fairfax, began to turn the tide. By 1646, after a string of defeats culminating in the fall of Oxford, Charles was forced to surrender to Scottish forces, who later handed him over to Parliament in exchange for payment of their war debts. The king, once untouchable, was now a prisoner, his fate hanging in the balance as his enemies debated what to do with a monarch who refused to concede defeat. Even in captivity, Charles proved a formidable adversary, exploiting divisions among his captors to sow discord. Parliament itself was fractured, with moderates seeking a negotiated settlement that would preserve the monarchy under strict conditions, while radicals, including many in the army, began to question whether a king was necessary at all. Charles, ever the tactician, played these factions against each other, engaging in secret negotiations with the Scots and others in hopes of regaining his throne by force. His duplicity came to a head in 1647 with the so-called engagement, a covert agreement with the Scots to invade England on his behalf in exchange for religious concessions. When this Second Civil War broke out in 1648, it was swiftly crushed by Cromwell's forces, but the king's willingness to plunge the nation back into bloodshed shattered any remaining trust. For many, particularly the army's leaders, this was the final straw. Charles could no longer be reasoned with, nor could he be allowed to remain a symbol for royalist resistance. The rising conflict of the English Civil War thus transformed a political dispute into a profound crisis of legitimacy. Charles's refusal to compromise, coupled with Parliament's growing radicalism, created a chasm that could not be bridged by words or treaties. As the king's armies fell and his schemes unraveled, the question shifted from how to limit his power to whether he should wield any at all. The stage was set for a reckoning, one that would take place not on the battlefield, but in a courtroom where the very concept of monarchy would be put on trial. The path to that historic confrontation, however, would be paved with further intrigue and betrayal, as the nation grappled with the unthinkable prospect of judging its own king. With the Second Civil War crushed by the summer of 1648, King Charles I found himself not just defeated, but utterly isolated, a prisoner of the very forces he had sought to outmaneuver. His surrender to the Scots in 1646 and subsequent handover to Parliament had marked the beginning of a humiliating descent, stripping away the aura of invincibility that once surrounded him. Now, as the dust of renewed conflict settled, the king was held under tight guard, first at various estates and eventually at Hurst Castle, a bleak fortress on the Hampshire coast, where the cold stone walls mirrored the desolation of his cause. The man who had once ruled 3 kingdoms was reduced to a figure of pity and scorn, his royal trappings replaced by the stark reality of captivity. Yet, even in chains, Charles remained defiant, clinging to the belief that his divine right could not be undone by mortal hands, a conviction that would only hasten his tragic fate. Charles's imprisonment was not merely physical but deeply symbolic, reflecting the profound shift in power that had occurred over the course of the civil wars. Parliament, bolstered by the military might of the new model army under Oliver Cromwell, held the reins of authority, but their victory brought no unity. The body was riven by factions. Presbyterians, who sought a negotiated settlement with the king under a constitutional monarchy, clashed with independents and army radicals, who increasingly viewed Charles as an irredeemable threat to the nation's future. The king's duplicitous actions during the Second Civil War, his secret dealings with the Scots to reignite conflict, had eroded any lingering trust among even his moderate opponents. For the army, in particular, Charles had become that man of blood, a tyrant whose repeated betrayals justified the most extreme measures. As debates raged in Westminster over what to do with their royal captive, the atmosphere grew thick with a sense of inevitability. A reckoning was coming, one that would challenge the very foundations of English society. Life in captivity for Charles was a far cry from the opulence of Whitehall or Windsor. At Hurst Castle, where he was moved in late 1648, the king endured harsh conditions, confined to cramped quarters with minimal comforts, his every move watched by suspicious guards. Historical accounts describe him as stoic, maintaining a dignified bearing despite the indignities he faced. He spent his days reading, praying, and writing letters, often to his family, expressing both his resolve and his sorrow at their separation. His beloved wife, Henrietta Maria, and their children were scattered, some in exile on the continent, leaving Charles to bear his burden alone. Yet, even in these dark hours, he refused to concede defeat, rejecting offers of compromise that would have required him to relinquish significant powers. To Charles, such concessions were tantamount to sacrilege, a betrayal of the divine trust placed in him at his coronation. His stubbornness, while rooted in principle, only fueled the determination of his enemies to bring him to account. The turning point came in December 1648, when the army, frustrated by Parliament's indecision and fearing a backslide into royalist compromise, took drastic action. Under the direction of Colonel Thomas Pride, soldiers purged the House of Commons of members sympathetic to a settlement with Charles, an event known as Pride's Purge. What remained was the so-called Rump Parliament, a diminished body dominated by radicals and army allies who were far less inclined to mercy. This purge was a clear signal that the military, led by Cromwell and his lieutenants, would no longer tolerate half measures. The king, they argued, was not merely a political problem but a moral one, a ruler whose actions had caused untold suffering and whose very existence threatened the fragile peace. With the Rump Parliament now aligned with the army's vision, the path was cleared for an unprecedented act, the trial of a reigning monarch for crimes against his own people. Charles, though isolated, was not unaware of the storm gathering around him. Rumors of radical intentions reached him even in the remote confines of Hurst Castle, and on the 23rd of December, 1648, he was abruptly moved to Windsor Castle, a more secure and symbolic location, under heavy guard. The journey was tense, with the king reportedly maintaining a calm demeanor, though inwardly he must have sensed the gravity of his situation. At Windsor, he was treated with a modicum of respect befitting his rank, allowed to wear his royal insignia, and attended by a small retinue. But the illusion of sovereignty was thin. Behind closed doors, the Rump Parliament passed an ordinance establishing a High Court of Justice to try the king for treason, a move that defied centuries of tradition, which held that a monarch could not be judged by earthly courts. Charles, when informed of these proceedings, dismissed them as unlawful, refusing to recognize any authority above his own. His defiance, however, could not alter the course of events now set in motion. The decision to try Charles was not made lightly, even among his fiercest critics. Cromwell himself, though a driving force behind the army's resolve, is said to have wrestled with the moral and practical implications of such an act. Regicide was uncharted territory, a step that could brand them as traitors in the eyes of history, or worse, plunge England into further chaos by inviting foreign intervention or royalist uprisings. Yet for many, the king's intransigence left no other choice. His repeated refusals to accept constitutional limits, his role in prolonging the wars, and his apparent willingness to sacrifice countless lives for personal power painted him as a danger that could not be contained by mere imprisonment or exile. The trial, then, was not just about punishing Charles, but about redefining the relationship between ruler and ruled, a radical experiment in justice that would send shockwaves through Europe. As January 1649 approached, the machinery of this historic trial was assembled with grim efficiency. Commissioners were appointed to serve as judges, though many prominent figures refused to participate, wary of the consequences. The charge against Charles was drafted: high treason, for waging war against his own parliament and people, and for being a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation. The king, still clinging to the belief that no court could lawfully try him, prepared to face his accusers with the same unyielding spirit that had defined his reign. But as he was moved once more, this time to London for the trial's commencement, the weight of his isolation and the enormity of what lay ahead must have pressed heavily upon him. The stage was set for a confrontation that would not only decide his fate but reshape the destiny of a nation. On the 20th of January, 1649, the cold, cavernous hall of Westminster became the stage for an event that defied the very order of the world as it was then understood. King Charles I, sovereign of England, Scotland, and Ireland, stood before a makeshift High Court of Justice, accused of high treason by the very subjects he believed he was ordained by God to rule. The air was thick with tension, the weight of history pressing down on every soul present as the king, clad in black and bearing the garter star of his royal order, faced a panel of commissionersmen who, in his eyes, had no right to judge him. This was no ordinary trial. It was a radical act of defiance against centuries of tradition, a moment where the divine right of kings was dragged into the harsh light of human law. The proceedings that unfolded over the next week would not only determine Charles's fate, but would challenge the foundations of monarchy itself, setting a precedent that echoed through the ages. The trial was held in the Great Hall of Westminster, a space typically reserved for grand state occasions, now transformed into a courtroom of unprecedented purpose. The Rump Parliament, purged of moderates and aligned with the army's radical vision, had established this High Court of Justice through an ordinance that many deemed illegal, as it lacked the assent of the House of Lords or the king himself. 68 commissioners were appointed to act as judges and jury, though fewer than half would ultimately attend, wary of the moral and political consequences of regicide. John Bradshaw, a relatively obscure lawyer, presided as Lord President of the court, his stern demeanor a stark contrast to the king's composed, almost regal bearing. The public was admitted to witness the spectacle, and the galleries buzzed with a mix of curiosity, fear, and outrage as Charles was brought in, his presence commanding silence despite his status as a prisoner. The charges against Charles were read with grave solemnity by the court's prosecutor, John Cook. The king was accused of being a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation, held responsible for the bloodshed of the civil wars, for levying war against Parliament, and for subverting the fundamental laws and liberties of England. The indictment painted him as a ruler who had abused his power to the detriment of his people, a man whose actions necessitated accountability, regardless of his anointed status. Yet, from the outset, Charles refused to acknowledge the court's legitimacy. When asked to plead guilty or not guilty, he challenged the very authority of the tribunal, declaring that no earthly power could judge a king, for he answered only to God. His voice, often faltering due to a lifelong stammer, carried a quiet defiance as he questioned, "By what power am I called hither? I would know by what authority I mean lawful." His refusal to enter a plea was taken as a denial of guilt, and the trial proceeded despite his protestations. Over the following days, the prosecution presented its case, calling witnesses to testify to Charles's role in instigating and prolonging the civil wars. They recounted his military campaigns against Parliament, his raising of armies, and his alleged encouragement of atrocities, though much of the evidence was circumstantial or based on public record, rather than direct testimony against the king's person. Charles, denied legal counsel and forbidden to speak at length in his own defense, listened with a mixture of disdain and resignation. On several occasions he attempted to interject, arguing that the court was a mockery of justice and that his trial violated the ancient laws of the land. Each time, Bradshaw sternly rebuked him, insisting that even a king must answer for crimes against the Commonwealth. The exchanges between the two men grew increasingly heated, with Charles's calm insistence on his divine right clashing against Bradshaw's determination to uphold the court's authority, creating a drama that captivated all who watched. The trial was not without its surreal and poignant moments. Charles, though a prisoner, maintained an air of dignity that unsettled some of his accusers. He wore fine clothes, as if to remind all present of his royal status. And at one point, when Bradshaw's hat fell to the ground, the king pointed it out with a faint smile, a small gesture of courtesy amid the hostility. Yet beneath this composure, the strain of his situation was evident. Historical accounts note that he appeared pale and weary, the toll of years of conflict and months of imprisonment etched into his features. The public, too, was divided. Some in the galleries jeered. Others wept, torn between loyalty to the crown and anger at the suffering the wars had wrought. Outside Westminster, London simmered with unrest, as royalist sympathizers and parliamentary supporters clashed over the fate of their king. By the 27th of January, after several sessions, the court reached its inevitable conclusion. Charles was given a final opportunity to speak, and though he continued to deny the court's jurisdiction, he offered a defense of his actions, claiming he had fought not for personal gain, but to preserve the rights and privileges of his people under a lawful monarchy. His words, though eloquent, fell on deaf ears. The commissioners, under pressure from the army and radical elements in Parliament, had already decided his fate. After retiring to deliberate, they returned with a verdict, guilty of high treason and other high crimes. The sentence was death by beheading, to be carried out as a public execution. Bradshaw read the pronouncement with a trembling voice, aware of the gravity of the moment, while Charles listened in silence, his face betraying no emotion, though he must have felt the weight of his impending doom. The trial of Charles I was a seismic event, a public reckoning that stripped away the mystique of monarchy and asserted the radical notion that even a king could be held accountable for his actions. It was a flawed process, marred by legal irregularities and driven by political necessity rather than impartial justice, yet it was undeniably a turning point. As Charles was led away from Westminster Hall, the echoes of the verdict reverberated beyond the walls of the courtroom, stirring fear, hope, and uncertainty across a nation on the brink of transformation. The king, now condemned, faced his final days with a resolve that would define his legacy, while his enemies prepared for an act that would forever alter the course of English history. The morning of the 30th of January, 1649, broke cold and somber over London, a city holding its breath as it prepared to witness an act unthinkable just a decade before the execution of its king. Charles I, condemned by the High Court of Justice as a traitor to his own people, had spent his final days in St. James's Palace, a place once synonymous with royal splendor, now his last refuge before the scaffold. The air was bitter, frost clinging to the cobblestones of Whitehall, where a wooden platform draped in black had been erected outside the banqueting house, a fittingly grim stage for the end of a reign. A crowd gathered, a mix of the curious, the mournful, and the vengeful, their murmurs rising like a tide as soldiers of the new model army stood guard, ensuring no last-minute royalist uprising could save their fallen monarch. This was the climactic moment of a long and bloody struggle, a public spectacle of regicide that would sear itself into the memory of a nation and send shockwaves through the courts of Europe. Charles had been given little time to prepare for his fate after the court's verdict on the 27th of January. Moved from Westminster to St. James's, he spent his final nights in quiet reflection, attended by a small retinue of loyal servants and Bishop William Juxon, who provided spiritual comfort. Historical accounts paint a picture of a man resolute in the face of death, determined to meet his end with the dignity befitting a king. He wrote letters to his family, particularly to his son, the future Charles II, urging him to uphold the royal cause and warning against compromise with those who had brought him low. On the eve of his execution, he burned many of his personal papers, perhaps to protect allies or to ensure his private thoughts would not be exploited by his enemies. He slept fitfully, aware that each passing hour brought him closer to the axe, yet he clung to his belief in divine right, trusting that history and God would vindicate him. On the morning of his execution, Charles rose early, dressing with care in fine clothes, including 2 shirts to prevent shivering in the cold, which might be mistaken for fear. He wore a black cloak and the insignia of the Order of the Garter, a final assertion of his royal status. He took communion with Bishop Juxon, praying for strength and forgiveness, and ate a modest breakfast, maintaining a calm demeanor that impressed even his guards. Around 10 o'clock, he was escorted through the palace grounds toward Whitehall, a short journey that must have felt like an eternity. As he walked, flanked by soldiers and followed by a small entourage, the weight of the moment was palpable. The king, though a prisoner, carried himself with an air of quiet authority, his face pale but composed, his eyes fixed ahead as if already looking beyond the mortal realm. The scaffold at Whitehall was a stark, utilitarian structure, raised high so the crowd could witness the act. The executioner, whose identity remains uncertain to this day, some accounts suggest it was Richard Brandon, the common hangman, though he may have been assisted or replaced due to reluctance, wore a mask to conceal his face, a precaution against retribution. The block was low, requiring Charles to lie prone, an undignified position for a king, but one he accepted without complaint. As he stepped onto the platform, a hush fell over the crowd, broken only by the occasional sob or shout of defiance from royalist sympathizers. Soldiers formed a tight cordon, their muskets ready to quell any disturbance, while drummers stood poised to drown out any final words the king might speak, lest they rally his supporters. Charles, undeterred by the efforts to silence him, addressed those near the scaffold with a brief but poignant speech, his voice steady despite his stammer. He declared his innocence of the charges against him, asserting that he had always sought the good of his people and the preservation of their liberties, though under a monarchy guided by law. He forgave his enemies, prayed for the nation's peace, and affirmed his faith in the Church of England, a final rebuke to the Puritan radicals who had orchestrated his downfall. Turning to Bishop Juxon, he handed over his garter insignia and uttered his last public words. Remember, a cryptic instruction whose meaning has been debated by historians ever since, perhaps a charge to preserve his legacy or a personal message for his son. Then, with a gesture of readiness, he knelt, placed his head upon the block, and signaled the executioner with a slight movement of his hands after whispering a final prayer. The axe fell with a single, swift stroke, severing Charles's head from his body in an instant. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, followed by a groan of horror and disbelief, as the reality of what had just occurred sank in. The executioner held up the king's head, as was customary, though accounts differ on whether the traditional cry of, "Behold the head of a traitor," was uttered. Some say it was omitted out of respect or fear of the crowd's reaction. Blood soaked the scaffold, a vivid crimson against the black drapery, as soldiers moved quickly to disperse the onlookers, many of whom surged forward, some to dip cloths in the king's blood as relics, others to express their grief or outrage. The drummers beat a relentless rhythm, drowning out cries, while the king's body was swiftly removed, later to be embalmed and buried in St. George's Chapel, Windsor, without the full royal honors he might have expected. The execution of Charles I was a moment of profound rupture, a brutal and public end to a reign that had begun with such promise, but descended into division and war. It was not just the death of a man, but the symbolic death of an era, a shattering of the belief that kings ruled by divine mandate beyond the reach of human judgment. As the crowd dispersed and the scaffold stood empty, the echoes of that fatal blow lingered, a reminder of the cost of conflict and the audacity of those who dared to challenge the ancient order. England stood at a crossroads, its future uncertain, as the shadow of regicide cast a long and chilling pall over the land. The sharp, final thud of the executioner's axe on the 30th of January 1649 did not merely end the life of Charles I. It cleaved England's history in two, leaving a nation to grapple with the consequences of an act so radical that it reverberated far beyond the blood-stained scaffold at Whitehall. In the immediate aftermath, London was a city of stunned silence and simmering unrest, as the reality of regicide settled over its people like a heavy fog. The king's body, hastily prepared for burial, was interred without ceremony in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle on the 7th of February, denied the full royal honors that might have marked the passing of a monarch in less tumultuous times. Soldiers stood guard to prevent public mourning, while the Rump Parliament and the army moved swiftly to assert control, abolishing the monarchy and the House of Lords, and declaring England a Commonwealth, a republic governed without a king. Yet, this bold new experiment in governance was born in blood and division, and the shadow of Charles's death would loom large over the decades to come, shaping both the immediate future and the enduring memory of his reign. The political landscape of England transformed overnight with Charles's execution. The Commonwealth, led by figures like Oliver Cromwell, who emerged as the dominant force in the new regime, faced immediate challenges to its legitimacy. Royalist uprisings flared in parts of England, Scotland, and Ireland, fueled by loyalty to the crown and outrage at the king's death. Charles's eldest son, now Charles II, was proclaimed king by loyalists in exile and by the Scots, who had turned against the English Parliament after the execution. The ensuing Third Civil War saw Cromwell's forces crush these rebellions, notably at the Battle of Worcester in 1651, forcing Charles II to flee to the continent. Ireland, too, was brutally subdued, with Cromwell's campaigns leaving a legacy of bitterness that persists to this day. The Commonwealth's rule was marked by military might and Puritan austerity, a far cry from the royal pageantry of Charles I's court, but it struggled to win the hearts of a people weary of war and uncertain of a future without a monarch. Beyond England's borders, the execution sent shockwaves through Europe, where monarchs and courts recoiled in horror at the precedent set by the killing of an anointed king. In France, where Charles's widow, Henrietta Maria, and their children sought refuge, the news was met with grief and fear. Louis XIV, still a young king, saw in Charles's fate a warning of what could befall any ruler who lost the loyalty of their subjects. Across the continent, royalist propaganda painted Charles as a martyr, a saintly figure unjustly murdered by fanatical rebels, while Republican sympathizers, though few, saw the event as a bold assertion of the people's right to hold their rulers accountable. Diplomatic relations with England soured, as many nations refused to recognize the Commonwealth, isolating the fledgling republic on the world stage. The act of regicide, while a domestic revolution, became a cautionary tale for monarchies everywhere, a stark reminder of the fragility of divine right in the face of determined opposition. The personal toll on Charles's family was profound. Henrietta Maria, living in exile in France, was devastated by her husband's death, mourning not just the man but the collapse of the life they had built together. Their children, scattered across Europe, bore the weight of their father's legacy. Charles II and his brother James, later James II, became symbols of royalist hope, while their sisters faced uncertain futures in foreign courts. The young Charles II, in particular, carried the burden of avenging his father and reclaiming the throne, a mission that would define his life for over a decade. The family's fortunes were tied to the broader royalist cause, which, though diminished, never fully extinguished, as supporters across the British Isles and beyond clung to the memory of their fallen king, often idealizing him in death as they had not in life. In the longer term, the legacy of Charles I's trial and execution proved complex and enduring. The Commonwealth, despite its initial resolve, faltered under internal divisions and economic strain, collapsing after Cromwell's death in 1658. By 1660, amid growing nostalgia for monarchy and fear of continued instability, Charles II was restored to the throne in a bloodless transition, welcomed by a nation eager for normalcy. Yet, the restoration did not erase the memory of 1649. Instead, it cast Charles I as both a tragic figure and a cautionary one. Royalists venerated him as a martyrous image, as a pious, wronged king was immortalized in works like the icon Basilique, a posthumous memoir attributed to him that became a bestseller. The Church of England later commemorated him with a feast day, though this was discontinued in the 19th century. Conversely, critics of absolute monarchy pointed to his reign as evidence of the dangers of unchecked power, a lesson that influenced later constitutional developments in Britain and beyond. The trial and execution also left an indelible mark on legal and political thought. The notion that a ruler could be held accountable to their people, though radical in 1649, planted seeds for future revolutions, from the American and French upheavals of the 18th century to modern concepts of constitutional governance. In England, the event underscored the growing power of Parliament, a shift that, despite the restoration, could not be fully reversed. Charles I's death became a symbol of the struggle between authority and liberty, a debate that continues to resonate in discussions of sovereignty and justice. Historians remain divided on his character. Some see him as a stubborn autocrat whose inflexibility invited disaster, others as a principled man caught in an impossible tide of change, but few deny the pivotal role his fate played in shaping the modern state. As we reflect on the trial and execution of Charles I, a lingering question emerges. Can a nation truly heal from such a profound act of rupture, or does the blood of a king forever stain its history? His death was not just an end, but a beginning of a republic, of new ideas about power, and of a long journey toward reconciliation. For those who witnessed that cold January day, and for generations since, the image of a king on the scaffold remains a haunting reminder of the cost of division and the fragility of even the most sacred institutions. If this story has stirred thoughts or questions in you, share them with us. How do you see Charles I as tyrant or martyr? And what lessons does his fate hold for our understanding of power today?